Arirang Special.
Hello and welcome to this joint program by Arirang TV in Korea and VOA News here in Washington. This is a joint analysis of the first South Korea-U.S. summit between the current administrations. I'm Moon Ganyang or Jennifer Moon coming to you from Washington, D.C. Now I have here in the studio with me Steve Herman. Steve is the White House Bureau Chief for VOA News, and Steve will be giving us his side of the story. So I'll be providing you with the South Korean side of things as I'm traveling with the president here as a Blue House chief correspondent, and Steve will be giving that perspective in a different way from the White House perspective. So thank you, Steve, for this.
My pleasure.
And of course, we need someone to help us better read into what's going on. We have our expert in the studio, Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, correct? CFR.
Yes.
Yes, Scott. Good to see you again. Yeah. Nice to see you in D.C.
Glad to join you here.
All right, so let's talk about South Korea-U.S. summit, or South Korean President Moon Jae-in's first overseas trip to the United States. In fact, it's his first international trip ever, and he's chosen the U.S. Scott, I want to start with you. How would you assess the South Korean presidential office's decision to pick U.S. as his first destination and coming so soon into his presidency?
Well, first, it's traditional, I think, for the South Korean president to come and visit the United States first, given the fact that U.S. and South Korea are allies. But during the campaign, I think that it wasn't clear necessarily whether President Moon would, in fact, honor that tradition, especially because the timing of the election in May gave him a very short time to try to get ready. And also, everybody knew that there was going to be a G20 summit in Germany. And so this period of time when, frankly, the cabinet is not fully formed, and yet it is still prior to the G20, proved to be a window of opportunity. And actually, I think very significant that a progressive candidate like President Moon made this decision to put his visit to Washington first.
Right. I mean, President Moon makes thinks highly of President Trump in that he was the first president to call him, to congratulate him. And Mr. Moon told us that he feels Mr. Trump could relate to Mr. Moon because Mr. Trump still thinks he's fairly new into his administration and he's still recovering from the election, fever, if you will. So, and their phone conversation was very nice, and actually a number of top Blue House officials have told me that they were there when the phone conversations were happening, and despite all, quelling all fears, Mr. Trump seemed to be a nice guy, they said.
Well, I think in this particular case, the reason that, let's be frank, that there's so much interest in this administration about South Korea is really due to the tension with North Korea and the fact that there is the military alliance there, the great uncertainty. President Trump, of course, back in April had that summit at Mar-a-Lago with the Chinese president Xi Jinping, and the U.S. president was very confident that he was going to get help from the Chinese leader about putting some pressure on North Korea. And lately, President Trump has expressed some disappointment that things haven't moved as fast as he would have liked. And there's a lot of options that are now on the table. And it's been made very clear to President Trump by the intelligence community, by the State Department, by the Defense Department, that they do need to have the South Koreans looped in on this, and there was a bit of confusion there. Obviously, the impeachment of President Park was a huge distraction, and uncertainty about Moon Jae-in coming in and how much of a shift that's going to be. But I'm sure Scott will attest to this. But when candidates become leaders, regardless of what positions they may have taken during a campaign, the reality of the job, geopolitics, has a sense of sobering them up very quickly and having them shift, if they're on the left, more to the center, if they're on the right, more to the center. And I suspect we're going to see the same thing with President Moon as far as the relationship with the U.S. forces and North Korea.
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of people, when they began to look at what was happening in South Korea, they immediately went back to the Roh Moo-hyun administration as the framework for thinking about what the relationship would look like, and they saw that there was a Republican administration, so we immediately think about No and Bush. But so much has changed.
Mr. Moon being one of the closest confidants of former President Roh.
That's right. And also, if you looked at the Moon campaign platform, it could have been pulled off the shelf from the Roh Moo-hyun administration. And so naturally, I think for people in Washington, a lot of those memories of underlying tensions that were kind of patched over during that period came back. But I think there are just so many different contextual differences that exist now. President Moon is constrained by domestic politics. You have high Korean public support for the alliance with the United States. And you have an atmosphere internationally of much greater tension. And North Korea, in contrast to North Korea under Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un is already set in a different direction. And so, these are realities that I think have kind of underscored the importance of working together within an alliance framework. And President Moon has actually been very quick to adjust to that reality in response to what had to have been a steep learning curve over the course of the past 6 weeks.
I mean, he did campaign on his motto that he's a prepared president. He's been prepping and teaching himself to be a good president for the last 5 years and whatnot. I mean, with North Korea, of course, the geopolitical tensions on the Korean Peninsula is higher than ever. I mean, would you say that the Trump administration's, I suppose, desire to connect with the South Korean leadership now is mostly because of North Korea, because Mr. Trump actually wants to resolve North Korea?
I think that's first and foremost. There are also trade disputes, and the president, since Mr. Moon has arrived, has been talking a lot about that and been very blunt and saying, we're negotiating a trade treaty right now. And he's made it very clear that he's very dissatisfied with KORUS. That is something that the president needs to demonstrate for his domestic constituency, that the result of this visit is going to be more jobs for Americans. That's true of any major foreign leader that's coming to the United States in the Trump administration. But what is unique about the relationship with Seoul, of course, is this issue with North Korea. And President Trump, alongside President Moon, his words have been very blunt. And I'm sure that the North Koreans are going to see it as threatening. It wasn't Mr. Trump who, in the Rose Garden, was even mentioning the possibility of real dialogue. Mr. Moon, of course, is leaving the door open. But I think the real question, and I'd be very interested to hear what Scott has to say about this, but all indications that I'm getting from people who have been working in North Korea and follow North Korea is they have a belief that the people around Kim Jong-un right now are actually quite hardline and are really not open to negotiations, and are certainly not going to agree to the first principle from the United States and the EU and the UN and South Korea for negotiations, which is putting a freeze on their ballistic missile and nuclear weapons development program. So perhaps what we may be seeing is sort of a good cop, bad cop scenario where the U.S., the White House says to President Moon, sure, if you think there's a channel there for negotiations, try to go for it. But we're gonna maintain this hard line position. We're gonna have the sticks, and if you want to offer some carrots, see how far you get with that. But a lot of people in this town are very skeptical based on what's happened in the past and the mood, the signals that they're seeing from Pyongyang, that there really is any possibility of a negotiation, let alone six-way talks. But what are you hearing?
Well, it's absolutely the case that we're in a situation where within North Korea you have a stated public commitment to nuclear development. We've had rhetoric about the idea that North Korea could use nuclear weapons against the United States. Frankly, North Korea so far is structurally not configured to engage with anybody in the world, the U.S. and South Korea included. And so really the first thing that I think is going to happen if we're going to expect any kind of dialogue is for North Korea to create a structure that enables dialogue to occur. President Moon has already sent, by my count, 3 trial balloons. First, the approval of a South Korean NGO to provide malaria supplies. Second, approval for some kind of discussion about a commemoration of the June 2000 denuclearization, inter-Korean agreement.
Yes.
And then, thirdly, the idea of a joint Olympic team, and every single one of them have been popped by the North Koreans. We don't know who Kim Yang-gon, the former negotiator with South Korea, is in North Korea today. And North Korea's Kim Jong-un is going to have to find that person and put him in place in order for dialogue to be resumed.
The only positive sign we've seen out of North Korea, if you can call it a positive sign lately, and perhaps this is one thing that is due to Chinese pressure, is there hasn't been another nuclear test. That's it. But the ballistic missile development program seems like it's going full speed ahead.
Sure.
And as Scott said, there's just no signals, no response to the overtures that have been coming from Seoul. And we know that there has been back-channel communication between the United States and the North Koreans, both formally and the so-called Track 1.5, Track 2. And we're just not getting any positive signals. And the rhetoric that has come out of Pyongyang, as you mentioned, it does still seem like that Pyongyang is saying, look, we don't want to deal with, as they refer to the South Korean government as a puppet regime. We want to deal with the United States on an equal basis. That's where their starting point is. So I think, President Moon is in a very difficult spot with regards to Pyongyang, because what happens now if, with his background, if there are no positive overtures from Pyongyang?
That's right. And really what we're talking about is that the North Koreans reiterated they want to talk with the United States about the nuclear issue just within the past 48 hours in Norong Shinmun. So that message is clear. But in the absence of any evidence that we're moving toward dialogue, the Trump administration is really looking to increase the pressure. And so I think the other relevant issue related to the summit, but not directly involved with the summit, was the U.S. stepping up of unilateral secondary sanctions on entities that do business with North Korea, including the Bank of Dandong.
But Treasury Secretary Mnuchin made a big deal about this. Came out and spoke to reporters at the White House just as President Moon was arriving, and said, we've only begun with sanctions, and we can have a lot of more sanctions. But as you pointed out, there have been sanctions going on now for many years, and I think to most people who follow this, they would have been very surprised that the Bank of Dandong has any access to the U.S. banking system anyway. So does this really make a difference?
Well, this is the thin end of the wedge. I mean, in an odd sort of way, I do believe that this is a step forward, because it's my understanding that the Bank of Dandong has actually been in the crosshairs for the U.S. government now for months and months. And in fact, they've signaled privately in the past that they were on the way to sanctioning the bank, and they didn't do it. But if you're going to sanction a Chinese entity, first of all, I mean, the real issue is that the U.S. and China just had high-level talks on this issue. The Trump administration clearly was dissatisfied with the answers they were hearing from the Chinese, and so now they're taking steps to put pressure on Chinese entities, regardless of what the Chinese government thinks. And so this, I do think, will be a shift. The U.S. needs South Korea's support in order to do this, but there's still a very interesting question as we see the dividing line between the U.S. ROK and China on the other side, how that is going to play out and what the implications are going to be in terms of North Korea feeling the pressure.
Sure, because as we always say, every time I host a North Korea-related show, we all end in saying that, yes, China holds the key to this North Korea problem.
But if you're China right now, looking at what the Trump administration has sort of ramped up with the big arms sales to Taiwan, possible port calls of U.S. naval ships to Taiwan, the tariffs coming on steel, are the Chinese really going to say, well, we're going to bend over backwards to help you out, Washington, with North Korea?
That's right. There is a risk because cooperation with China is necessary to deal with North Korea, but it is not sufficient. And so in the process of dealing with that gap between necessary and sufficient, if you sacrifice what is necessary, then you're actually in a worse position than you would be just focusing on the U.S.-China cooperation part of the equation.
I want to move away a little bit and back to this South Korean President Moon Jae-in's visit to the U.S. So the two presidents had dinner, and like you said, the most comparable instance would be Prime Minister Modi's visit just earlier this week.
Right. It wasn't a state visit. It was the first time that President Trump hosted a dinner for a foreign leader in the White House, because the previous dinners with Chinese President Xi Jinping, most notably, was at Mar-a-Lago. So President Moon is actually the second one to have dinner. And what was interesting is that the dinner was held before the talks. Usually they have the one-on-one talks in the Oval Office. Then there's the extended dialogue, usually in the cabinet room. And then the dinner is held to sort of wrap things up. But in a sense, this may have been a good icebreaker for them to get to know each other in a more casual setting before holding the talks. And President Trump said that at that dinner, they were actually talking about a trade treaty right away, and that he had made progress. And on Friday morning, the president sounded very positive about some breakthroughs in the trade arena. So, all signs are there. We'll have to see, what happens after, and the South Koreans go home and huddle about it, and whatever the media reaction is, I think will have some influence back in South Korea as well. But from the point of this administration, they seem to feel like they're having some satisfaction from their discussions.
The main goal for the Moon administration coming to the U.S. this time around was to basically establish a good working friendship based on trust. And I think a lot of the events, a lot of the itinerary that President Moon has been, carrying out in the U.S., starting from laying wreath at the Changjin Reservoir Memorial to a moving speech about how the U.S., the Americans, were the ones who came and rescued, tens of thousands of refugees during the Korean War, which includes his own parents. And I think all of that really, they try to highlight the blood link there, the alliance between South Korea and the U.S. At the same time, after the dinner, the press secretary came back to the media room and to the South Korean media room, and he briefed us on what was discussed and whatnot. And he told us about North Korea, and the two leaders had a wide range of things to discuss. The end. And so we thought that was so. And then within seconds, I saw a tweet by Donald Trump, and he said, we had a very good conversation. President of South Korea and I discussed North Korea and a new trade deal.
Right.
So immediately I raised up my hand and I was like, new trade deal. So President Donald Trump is saying you guys discussed a new trade deal. What is this? And they declined to answer.
Well, I think, again, President Trump sometimes interprets things the way he wants to interpret them that may be much less formal than people who deal professionally in diplomacy are used to. And so in President Trump's mind, what they're talking about may be a new trade deal. What may be in the minds of the South Korean team is we're looking at perhaps refining chorus a little bit. But I think this potentially, as much as any issue differences on North Korea, because we know that President Trump holds trade as something very important to his administration and is expressed blunt dissatisfaction with chorus. But as we saw with NAFTA, his position originally on NAFTA was to scrap it. Mm-hmm. And now he's come around, perhaps due to conversations with both the leaders of Canada and Mexico, that NAFTA can be saved but needs to be modified. So it'll be very interesting, I think, in the weeks ahead to see how both Seoul and Washington nuance the language about what we're really dealing with here.
You know, the double-edged nature of evaluating this summit is that you can really only talk about the trade issues if you've taken the security issues off the table. Mm. And so in that sense, I think the Moon administration ended up being pretty successful at taking all the security issues off the table, but then they ran up against some of President Trump's long-held visceral views related to Korea as a free rider. I think the White House signaled that that might happen a couple of days in advance, but by that time it was really unlikely that it would be possible to take the trade issues off the table as well.
Mm-hmm, definitely. I mean, and I think this was a really good icebreaker in that the two presidents got to know each other, both personally and professionally. And from here on forth, I'm sure there are many, many disagreements. I'm sure there are many, many issues that they need to spend nights, or their working staff need to spend nights trying to negotiate. But at least they've started off on talking grounds. They will be discussing these issues with one another. I think that's one of the positive points. I want to ask you, Scott, about how you think the relationship between the Moon administration and the Trump administration should move forward for the development of South Korea-U.S. alliance.
Okay, well, first I just want to mention that it's important that even next week there's going to be another meeting, a trilateral dinner, yes, that will include Prime Minister Abe. Mm-hmm. But you know, basically I think that what we're going to see, the theme under the Trump administration has been pretty intensive focus on North Korea. That has driven 4 cabinet-level visits to Seoul already. I see no sign that that is going to stop. And so there's going to be a demand for very close coordination on the North Korea issues from Washington as we move forward. And how things continue to develop will depend in part on how the Moon administration continues to respond to that demand.
And I think what will also be key is what North Korea does. If there is another ICBM test, then the Trump administration is going to feel compelled to do something more than it has done previously. And I think President Moon is going to feel pressure to have to respond in sync with Washington very quickly.
Correct, but I think should there be another ICBM test, it might be easier for President Moon to, ratchet up his hardline policy as well, because he has made a promise with the South Korean people that he would open up for dialogue with North Korea. But if North Korea continues with its provocations, then he doesn't need to go out and convince the public that they cannot be rewarded for bad behavior. So I think that might make things easier for him. We're running out of time, and as like Mr. Moon and Mr. Trump, I'd like to ask you guys for a return visit to Seoul. I'm sure you often come to Seoul, both of you, and when you do, I'll invite you to our studio in Seoul, Arirang studio, and we can have a longer discussion then. And I'm sure many things would have evolved and developed by then as well, judging from the speed of how quickly the situation on the Korean Peninsula and North Korea-U.S. relations, South Korea-U.S. relations progress.
Well, according to President Moon, President Trump is coming sometime this year, so
Yes.
we'll see you there.
Yeah, and we'll
Look forward
see,
to that.
and I'll see you guys as well in Seoul.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for today. Although I am the guest, as I come from Seoul, I will be closing out this program. Thank you both, gentlemen, and thank you all for watching this program. Coming to you from Washington, D.C. for a special analysis of the first summit between South Korean President Moon Jae-in and U.S. President Donald Trump. This was a joint program by VOA and Arirang News in Seoul. I'm Moon Gon-young, and we'll see you again sometime this year.